We're now joined by two very distinguished scholars talking about police reform and a range of issues. Thomas Shea, professor and program director of the Police Graduate Studies Program in the College of Education and Human Services at Seton Hall University, and Juan Rios, assistant professor of social work in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work at Seton Hall University. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, Steve.
Tom, let me ask you, the work that you and Juan are doing around police reform and related issues, why is it more important now than ever?
Well, I think, and much to our own fault in policing, I don't think we've humanized the profession enough. And I think that goes back to the fact that it's sort of paramilitary type structure, wearing uniform and authoritative. And I think that the message gets lost that behind that uniform are people. And people with faults and people that do bad things, and just like any other segment of the population. And I think that the difference between that and the rest of the population in the United States is that policing seems to be the one segment of population where it's okay to generalize, many of whom are minorities. But I'm always very careful about how I phrase this because this is such a sensitive issue. I'm a staunch critic of bad and corrupt police, but a staunch supporter and defender of good police. And I think that a lot of the good police are going through some very difficult times right now.
Hey, Tom, your background in law enforcement, tell everyone.
I retired from the Long Branch Police Department in 2017 to enter academia.
Juan, you have a personal connection to these, not only this subject, it's not even one subject. You have a personal connection. Share it, please. Absolutely.
So the work that I'm doing not only is driven by the importance of how this affects our society at the current state, but also my background. I have an uncle who was shot and killed by a police officer through a routine stop and frisk situation. And, back in the 80s, stop or I'll shoot was not a suggestion. And having that loss firsthand, what it's like to lose someone at the hands of overzealous policing definitely does inform one, how I both engage with the community regarding this topic, but as well as to having corrective relationships, such as the partnership I have with Thomas Shea, being able to collaborate with law enforcement officers and the police officers who all want the same thing as community members, which is we want safe communities.
And is that what the Community Care and Justice Initiative is all about, Tom?
Well, that's actually more Juan's baby. I was brought into that.
Juan, jump in on that, and I'll come back to you, Tom.
Yeah, of course. So the Community Care and Justice Initiative is a very innovative and fantastic initiative because we bring in a partnership from 1, Essex County, 2, the South Orange Municipality, and 3, Seton Hall. So we have the academic research component, we have the community component, and we have law enforcement really driving it. So it's really being able to look at how can this partnership be able to identify what the community's values, assets, and needs look like. And we define community not just for residents, but residents, neighbors, and visitors, and law enforcement is included within that population.
Hey, Tom, let me ask you something, particularly with your law enforcement background. How do we pursue, quote unquote, police reform, whether it's better training, whether it's increasing diversity, and our law enforcement units across the nation are not nearly as diverse as they need to be, reflecting the communities they serve, a whole range of other things, including the Civilian Review Board in Newark and other places being talked about. Tom, how do we do that without so many police officers, your brothers and sisters in blue that you no longer work with, but tell me all the time and tell you, we're under siege. We can't do our job. We are now the enemy. And we can't even protect the people who are most vulnerable, who are disproportionately black and brown. Loaded question, I know, but how the heck do you pursue police reform without demonizing the police, who feel demonized? Many.
They do.
Not just a few.
And rightly so. Rightly so, some of them do. Some of my colleagues, matter of fact, my former colleagues in the Long Branch Police Department were retired, but I think that we have to, well, that's one of the reasons why I started the research project that is now involved with that project that Juan's doing in South Orange. I interviewed a bunch of cops in anonymity, and I think that's a shame that they're being interviewed in anonymity because I think they would be looked at completely different. And they should be able to disagree. And I'm not talking about the police leaders. The police leaders come out and give those stock answers that we see in the paper, not all of them, generally speaking. but they give those stock answers regarding what does not reflect the moral compass of this agency. And I think that if we humanize the profession more and let the people from the street talk, the ones that are having daily interactions with people. And the second part of that is there needs to be an increase in accountability in policing. And part of that, I just completed a research project with a professor from St. John's University, Dr. Bernard Jones, an African-American professor who had a lot of bad experiences with policing. And we completed a project where we discussed taking the internal affairs component out of the police department, not to a civilian complaint board, but to competent, professional, former IA, former internal affairs investigators to have an objective and independent investigation.
Is the basic argument that having internal affairs is an inherent conflict?
I think
is that the argument?
I was an internal affairs officer for 6 years, and it's a very, very difficult job when you're investigating people that you work with, whether you feel you're doing the right thing or not. Moral courage is a very difficult thing to do, and it's very easy to take the laissez-faire approach.
How strong is the code of blue, the blue code? How strong is it, Tom?
I always hear blue code, and I don't necessarily believe in that, at least from my experience.
You may not believe in it, but you believe it exists?
I believe it exists, but not in the sense that they're doing it because they're covering for other quote unquote police officers. I think it's more of a human nature aspect, not to want to talk out against your own.
Well, let me ask you, you come to this not just as an academic and a scholar, but someone who's experienced, as you just shared a little bit of it, and we can't even imagine the kinds of things you face. Do you believe it's realistic over the next 5 to 10 years that real meaningful, forget about just police reform, but that communities, disproportionately communities of color, that the majority of people in those communities could begin to have real respect for men and women in blue with a gun and a badge serving to protect them, in spite of the Derek Chauvins of the world?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, absolutely. I think that when we talk about policing, and I'm going to give my example, as you mentioned earlier, my lived experience of having someone killed who is my father figure created a sense of disconnect and disdain whenever I seen someone in blue approach me. I know what it's like to have my face on the hood of a car. I know what it's like to get tackled in my community for just being in front of my household and someone else would fit the description. But these corrective relationships and partnerships like I have with Tom are the ones that have been able to help me look at policing differently, but we're all saying the same thing. One thing that Tom says that I quote all the time is that we have to move away from tribalism. One of the most profound statements that he made to me, he said, what do you have when you have 100 good cops and 3 bad cops, but those 100 good cops do not do anything in order to correct those bad cops? What do you have? 103 bad cops. But Tom is one of those good ones. And what I've seen in him is that we are saying the same things in our community. We want relationships, how we're policed, by who we're policed, that the folks who are policing have a connection to the community, have an investment to human dignity and worth. And that is how we move forward together, not through tribalism.
Yeah, again, we don't attempt to serve as judge, jury, or anything else, but I mentioned Derek Chauvin. There are several of the police officers who stood, and not just stood by, but stood and kept the crowd away and did not stop their colleague from doing what he did to George Floyd. People can decide for themselves what a good cop or a bad cop is or is not. Hey, Tom and Juan, thank you. And by the way, Seton Hall is one of our higher ed partners, and I've been honored to teach there for the last several years in the Buccino Leadership Institute. So I want to thank you, gentlemen, and wishing you and your colleagues all the best.
Thank you so much for your time, Steve.
Thank you for
being here.
Thank you, gentlemen. We'll be right back.
Think Tank with Steve Adubato has been a production of the Caucus Educational Corporation. Funding has been provided by the Healthcare Foundation of New Jersey, TD Bank, ADP, the Fidelco Group, the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities Clean Energy Program, Johnson & Johnson, Fedway Associates, Inc., MD Advantage Insurance Company, and by the Adler Aphasia Center. Promotional support provided by ROINJ and by NJ.com.
Hi, I'm Governor Tom Kean. A dear friend of mine had aphasia, which is a language disorder that occurs from a brain injury or a stroke. It robs a person's ability to communicate, but it doesn't affect their intellect. Programs and services offered at the Adler Aphasia Center help to improve my friend's communication skills, as well as her self-confidence and quality of life. Most importantly, she was among people who understood her. If you or a loved one has been diagnosed with aphasia, there is hope.